They were already saying goodbye. 18 doctors stood shoulder to shoulder around the marble island of the Crown Hill penthouse kitchen, their white coats glowing under surgical lights that had been wheeled in so quickly the room still smelled faintly of ozone and disinfectant. Accents collided. Orders overlapped. A monitor shrieked and then dipped into a thin, terrifying line. Someone whispered, "We're losing him," and no one contradicted it. Alistair Crownhill did not move. He stood with his hands braced on the counter as if the stone might slide away if he let go. His son lay on a warming pad where breakfast had been served 3 hours earlier. Baby Peregrine, 6 months old, skin gone dusky, lips tinged blue, chest fluttering with shallow, uneven breaths. Seraphine Crownhill hovered at his side, fingers pressed to her mouth, eyes glassy with shock that had nowhere left to go. They had brought the best. A pediatric neurologist from Boston with a reputation for miracles. A toxicologist from Zurich who lectured in 5 languages. A neonatal specialist from Kyoto who had flown overnight and arrived without changing clothes. Their watches were worth more than some houses. Their voices were steady. Their answers were not. Possible metabolic collapse. Could be an autoimmune cascade. Run the panel again. We don't have time. Time was the only thing Peregrine did not have. Across the room, half hidden by the pantry door, Eamon Vale stood with his hands clasped behind his back. 13 years old. Thin. Dark hair cropped close, because it was easier to keep clean that way. He wore the navy jacket his mother insisted on when he came upstairs, the one that made him look smaller, quieter, easier to overlook. He had learned how to stand without drawing the eye. He had learned where to place his feet, so they did not squeak. He had learned to breathe shallowly when important people argued. Eyes down. Mouth shut. Don't exist in rooms like this. Eamon did not look at the doctors. He looked at Peregrine's skin, at the way the baby's fingers curled and uncurled as if grasping for something just out of reach, at the glass of water on the counter, sweating in the heat of the lights, at the bouquet beside it, yellow lilies drooping, their sweet scent cloying now, almost nauseating. His heart began to hammer. 3 hours earlier, the kitchen had been full of laughter. Peregrine had sat in his high chair, clapping his hands, gum slick with drool as he chewed on the silk ribbon tied around the flowers that had arrived that morning. A gift, the card said. No signature. Seraphine had laughed and said they were beautiful. Eamon had carried the vase to the counter, careful not to spill, and he had noticed then the faint sheen on the stems, the way the ribbon left a sticky trace on his fingers. He had wiped his hands on his trousers and thought no more of it. By noon, Peregrine had stiffened in his chair, a strange sound tearing from his throat. By 1, his tiny body had been seized by convulsions that did not respond to the first medication or the second. By 2, the penthouse had become a battlefield of certainty and fear, of expertise colliding with the simple fact that nothing was working. Now, at the edge of the room, Eamon watched the baby's chest hitch and stall. He watched the monitor dip again. He watched a doctor glance at another and make a small, decisive nod. "We need to intubate," the doctor said. "Prepare the airway." Eamon's stomach dropped. He remembered his grandmother's voice as clearly as if she were standing beside him, salt wind in her hair, hands smelling of crushed leaves and clean earth. She had taught him to watch bodies before listening to words. She had taught him that not every storm came from within. Some came from what touched you, what you swallowed without knowing. Cold water shocks the vagus nerve, she had said once, when he was younger and frightened by a neighbor's seizure. Sometimes it brings them back. Sometimes it kills them. That's why doctors don't do it anymore. Eamon had never seen it done to a baby. He had never seen it done in a room like this, where money hummed in the walls and certainty wore white coats. But he had seen the signs before. The rigidity that did not fit a fever. The way Peregrine's eyes rolled, not in pain but in confusion. The residue at the corner of his mouth. Not milk, not foam, but something else. He took a step forward. His mother's voice rose in his head, sharp with fear. "Don't interfere. Don't draw attention. People like us don't get second chances." "Excuse me," Eamon said, or tried to. The word dissolved in the air between the doctors' voices. No one turned. A nurse adjusted a line. A doctor checked a chart. Another reached for a tube. Eamon felt the room narrowing, the way it did before a storm broke over the sea. He saw the lilies again, their petals curling inward as if ashamed. He saw Peregrine's hand twitch and then fall still. "We're going to lose him if we don't act," someone said. Eamon's mouth went dry. He took another step, closer now, close enough to smell antiseptic and metal and the faint sweetness of flowers. His voice came out louder this time, thin but sharp. "Please, wait." A head turned, just one. A frown flickered. "Who is this?" "Ma'am," Eamon said, "to anyone, to everyone. I think it's not what you think." Security shifted near the doorway, a subtle tightening that Eamon felt more than saw. His mother stood beyond them, frozen, eyes wide, a hand half lifted as if to pull him back by sheer will. The doctor who had frowned turned away again. "We don't have time for this." The monitor dipped. Seraphine made a sound that was not a word. Eamon's thoughts raced, tripping over each other. If he stayed where he was, if he obeyed the rules that had kept him safe for 13 years, the next sound he would hear would be the flat, final tone of a life ending. If he moved, if he did what he believed might work, everything else might end instead. His grandmother's hands had been steady when she taught him to count. 1, 2, 3. Don't rush. Don't hesitate. The doctor reached for the tube. If you think you know what happens next, listen closely and stay with the story, because what a 13-year-old boy does in the next moments will change every life in this room. Eamon took a breath. He looked at Peregrine, at the tiny chest that refused to give up yet, and he made a decision. Eamon did not move after he made the decision. Not yet. Decisions, he had learned, were dangerous things when made too quickly. They carried weight, consequences, and he had lived his entire life learning how to survive consequences by avoiding them. The room continued to churn without him. Voices overlapped. Shoes squeaked against marble. A nurse adjusted a monitor that did not want adjusting. Someone called out Peregrine's blood oxygen level, and someone else swore softly under their breath. Alistair Crownhill stared straight ahead, his jaw locked so tightly the muscle along his cheek trembled. Seraphine clutched the edge of the counter, as though the kitchen itself were the only thing keeping her upright. Eamon stood very still and let his mind move instead. It carried him backward, away from stainless steel and alarms, to a narrow house by the sea where the walls were never quite dry and the air always smelled of salt. His grandmother Rowena had lived there alone long before Eamon was born, and then with him after his parents sent him away when money grew tight and work grew scarce. Rowena Vale had never called herself a healer. She said she was only a woman who paid attention. She paid attention to how a cough sounded before it turned dangerous, to how a rash spread, to which plants caused blisters and which ones calmed them. She taught Eamon their names, not the Latin ones that lived in books, but the names people used when they needed help fast. Devil's trumpet, foxglove, star lily, pretty things, she said, often hid sharp edges. She taught him to notice residue, sap that clung to skin longer than water should, the difference between milk foam and something that did not belong in a baby's mouth. She taught him that the body had its own language, and if you listened closely enough, it told you what it needed. Cold was one of those languages. He remembered the first time she had spoken of it. A fisherman had collapsed near the docks, his body jerking, eyes rolled back, mouth slack. People had shouted for help. Someone had run for a car. Rowena had taken Eamon by the shoulders and told him to watch, not to touch. She had poured cold seawater over the man's head in a steady stream, counting under her breath. The seizure had broken. The man had lived. Sometimes it brings them back, she had said later, her hands shaking once they were alone. Sometimes it kills them. That is why you only ever use it when you are already out of time. Eamon blinked and found himself back in the penthouse kitchen. They were out of time. He looked again at the lilies. Yellow petals curled inward now, edges browning slightly. He remembered carrying the vase in that morning, how the stems had left a slick trace against the glass. He remembered Peregrine gnawing happily on the ribbon, his gums pink and eager, his fingers sticky afterward. He remembered wiping the counter and noticing that the cloth resisted, as though oil clung to the surface. The doctors were not fools. Eamon knew that. They were brilliant, accomplished, certain. But certainty could be loud, and loud things often drowned out quieter truths. They were searching for something rare and complicated, something worthy of the room they stood in. They were not looking at the flowers. A doctor called for another medication. A nurse hesitated. His response hasn't matched the last two. We don't have alternatives, the doctor snapped. Push it. Eamon felt a tightness in his chest that had nothing to do with fear and everything to do with clarity. The baby was not failing because of something missing. He was failing because of something that had been introduced. Something still working its way through his small body. Eamon swallowed and glanced toward the doorway. His mother stood there, her face pale, her eyes locked on him. Gracevale had worked in houses like this since before Eamon could remember. She had taught him how to fold himself small, how to carry trays without clatter, how to disappear into corners when important conversations happened. She had taught him, above all, not to draw attention. Her gaze begged him to stop. He loved her for that. He loved her because she was afraid. The monitor dipped again. Peregrine's chest stuttered. Eamon took one careful step forward. I think, he said, louder now, his voice cracking but audible. I think he's reacting to something. A few heads turned. Not all. Enough. A woman with silver hair and tired eyes looked at him, irritation flashing across her face. Who are you? I'm Eamon, he said. He forced himself to keep his shoulders back. My grandmother taught me about plants. About poisons. There it was. The word hung in the air, unwelcome. Another doctor scoffed. This is not the time. This is exactly the time, Eamon said, surprised by the steadiness in his own voice. He pointed, his finger trembling despite his efforts. Those flowers. The baby was chewing on the ribbon. There was residue. The silver-haired doctor followed his finger, if only out of reflex. Her gaze flicked to the bouquet, then back to the monitors. We screen for toxins. Not all of them show up, Eamon said. He could hear Rowena in his head, calm and firm. Some break down fast. Some look like something else. Security shifted again. One of the guards took a step closer to him. Alistair Crownhill finally turned. His eyes were bloodshot, his expression raw. Are you saying, he demanded, that my son has been poisoned by flowers? Eamon met his gaze. For a moment, the world narrowed to the space between them. I am saying he's not sick, Eamon replied. And if you do what you're about to do, it could make it worse. The room went very quiet. Then someone laughed, sharp and incredulous. This is absurd. We are not taking medical advice from a child, another voice said. Eamon felt the familiar heat of being dismissed, the way his words seemed to fall to the floor before they reached anyone's ears. He had known this would happen. Knowing it did not make it easier. He looked at Peregrine again, at the tiny face drawn tight, at the faint tremor running through his body. He thought of Rowena's hands counting seconds. He thought of the sea. He thought of the rules he had lived by, and how none of them had ever been written to save anyone else. The doctor reached again for the tube. Eamon's mother shook her head, tears spilling now. If you have ever wondered what you would do when no one believes you and the clock is running out, stay with this moment, because this is where everything hinges. Eamon drew in a breath that tasted like metal and flowers and fear. He knew now, with a certainty that left no room for doubt, that speaking was no longer enough. If he stayed where he was, Peregrine would die. If he moved, there would be consequences he could not predict. Eamon took another step forward, and then another, his heart pounding so loudly he was sure everyone could hear it. He did not know how the next seconds would unfold. He only knew that standing still was no longer an option. And so he moved. Eamon did not remember deciding to move. His body simply obeyed a command that had already been given somewhere deeper than thought. One moment he was standing in the narrow space between the pantry and the counter. The next he was reaching forward, his hands closing around Peregrine's small, limp form. The baby was lighter than Eamon expected. Terrifyingly light. A gasp tore through the room. Hey! Someone shouted. Security surged forward, but surprise slowed them just enough. Eamon turned, Peregrine pressed to his chest, the warmth of the baby's skin seeping through his jacket. He ran. Bare feet slapped against marble. A chair scraped and toppled. Seraphine screamed Peregrine's name, the sound sharp and breaking. Alistair shouted something that dissolved into noise as Eamon veered toward the kitchen sink, the largest one, the stainless steel basin that gleamed beneath the lights. Stop him! He's taking the baby! Eamon did not look back. He reached the sink, twisted the faucet with both hands, and cold water roared out in a violent rush. He could feel it in his bones before it even touched his skin, a shock that made his breath catch. His heart hammered, so hard he thought it might tear loose. He lifted Peregrine, hands trembling now, and turned the baby gently but firmly upside down, supporting his neck the way his grandmother had taught him. Careful, always careful. The water hit Peregrine's head in a sudden, brutal cascade. "No!" a doctor screamed. "He's drowning him!" Eamon shut out the sound. He shut out everything except the feel of cold water splashing back onto his wrists, the weight of the baby in his hands, the counting that had carried him through every lesson Rowena had ever given him. "One," he whispered, his voice barely audible over the roar of the faucet. Peregrine's body jerked violently. A spasm ripped through him, sharper than any before. "Two." Hands grabbed at Eamon's shoulders, fingers digging in. Someone tried to pull him back, but fear lent him strength he did not know he had. He leaned forward, shielding the baby with his own body, keeping the stream steady. 3. His vision blurred. Cold water splashed his face, stinging his eyes. His arms burned with the effort of holding on. "Get him off the baby! This is insane!" 4. Peregrine convulsed again, harder this time, his mouth opening in a silent cry. Eamon felt something twist inside his chest. Doubt flared, sharp and dangerous. What if he was wrong? What if this was the moment everything ended because of him? 5. "Please," Eamon whispered, tears spilling freely now, mixing with the water. "Please." Strong arms finally wrapped around his torso. Security had him. They pulled hard, dragging him backward. Eamon tightened his grip, just for a fraction of a second more, just long enough to finish. 6. Peregrine screamed. It was raw and furious and alive, a sound that cut through the room like lightning. The baby's body arched, then relaxed, his chest heaving as he drew in air, real air, not the shallow gasps from before. The monitor screamed again, but this time the sound was different. Faster. Stronger. Heartbeat. Oxygen climbing. Silence fell so suddenly it felt unreal. Eamon was wrenched away from the sink. The faucet continued to roar until someone reached out and shut it off. Water dripped from the counter, pooled on the floor. Peregrine was scooped into waiting hands, doctors crowding in, voices hushed now, urgent but no longer frantic. "What just happened?" someone whispered. A doctor stared at the monitor, disbelief etched into every line of her face. The seizure stopped. Another shook his head, slowly. That should not have worked. Eamon slid to the floor as security released him, his legs no longer able to hold his weight. He sat there, soaked, shaking uncontrollably, staring at his hands as if they belonged to someone else. Alistair Crownhill surged forward, his face red with rage and terror. "What did you do?" he shouted. "What did you do to my son?" Security tightened around Eamon again. He did not resist this time. He could not. The adrenaline drained out of him in a rush, leaving behind bone-deep exhaustion and a cold that had nothing to do with water. "I was trying to help," Eamon said. The words sounded small even to his own ears. "Arrest him," Alistair roared. "Get him away from my family." Seraphine dropped to her knees beside the counter, sobbing, her hands reaching out toward Peregrine as doctors worked over him. She did not look at Eamon. She could not look at anyone. One of the doctors, the silver-haired woman, raised a hand. "Wait!" Alistair turned on her. "He assaulted my child." She did not look away from the monitor. He interrupted a seizure. "Look at the vitals." The room leaned in collectively, as if drawn by gravity. Numbers stabilized. The frantic spikes smoothed into something that resembled normalcy. Peregrine cried again, weaker this time but unmistakably alive. Seraphine let out a broken laugh and collapsed forward, pressing her face into her hands. No one spoke for a long moment. Eamon felt a sob rise in his chest, fierce and unstoppable. He pressed his lips together, refusing to let it out. He had done what he came to do. Whatever happened next was no longer in his control. Security hauled him to his feet. His mother appeared in front of him, her face streaked with tears, her hands shaking as she reached for him. A guard blocked her gently but firmly. "It's going to be okay," Eamon said to her, though he had no idea if it was true. "I am Soda." She shook her head violently. "You did nothing wrong," she whispered, her voice breaking. "If you are still listening, do not look away now. This is the moment when courage meets consequence, and not everyone survives it the same way." Eamon was led toward the hallway, away from the kitchen, away from the sound of Peregrine's breathing growing steadier with every passing second. He did not look back. He was afraid that if he did, he would fall apart completely. As the doors closed behind him, he sat down against the wall, wet clothes clinging to his skin, and waited to learn what the world did to boys who dared to act when no one asked them to. Eamon waited on a narrow bench in the hallway outside the penthouse kitchen, his wet clothes clinging to his skin as they dried unevenly in the cooled air. The marble beneath him leached what little warmth he had left, but he did not move. He had learned long ago that stillness often passed for obedience, and obedience sometimes softened outcomes. Time stretched strangely. Voices drifted through the closed doors, muted now, no longer sharp with panic. He heard the steady rhythm of Peregrine's monitor through the wall, a sound that rose and fell like breathing itself. Each beat felt like a small mercy. A guard stood nearby, no longer gripping Eamon's arm, but not leaving either. His mother paced at the far end of the corridor, her steps short and restless. When their eyes met, she tried to smile. It wavered and fell apart. Eamon stared at his hands. They were red and raw from the cold water, faint lines etched into his palms where Peregrine's tiny body had rested. He wondered if those lines would ever fade. He wondered if he wanted them to. The door opened at last. Alistair Crownhill stepped into the hallway alone. He looked smaller than he had before. Not in stature, but in presence, as if something heavy had been lifted from him and left a hollow space behind. His suit jacket was unbuttoned, his tie loosened. His eyes were rimmed with red. The guard straightened. "Sir!" Alistair raised a hand. "Give us a moment." The guard hesitated, then nodded and stepped back. Grace Vale froze where she stood, her breath caught between hope and fear. Alistair approached Eamon slowly and stopped a few feet in front of him. For a long moment, he said nothing. He simply looked at the boy, at the soaked jacket, the bare feet, the trembling that Eamon could not quite control. "You saved my son," Alistair said at last. Eamon swallowed. "He's breathing," he said carefully. "That's what matters." Alistair nodded once. Then, to Eamon's shock, he lowered himself to one knee on the marble floor. Grace gasped softly. "I did not see you," Alistair said, his voice rough. "Not until it mattered. I trusted the wrong things. I trusted money, titles, certainty, and I almost lost everything because of it." Eamon's throat tightened. He did not know what to do with this moment. He had imagined anger, punishment, shouting. He had not imagined this. "I'm sorry," Alistair continued, "for how I spoke to you, for what I ordered, for what I would have done if you had been wrong." Eamon shook his head. "You were scared," he said. "Anyone would be." Alistair looked up at him then, really looked, as though seeing him for the first time. "You were scared too." "Yes," Eamon admitted. "And you acted anyway." Footsteps echoed behind them. The silver-haired doctor joined them, her expression grave but controlled. "Mr. Crownhill," she said, "we've confirmed something you should hear." Alistair rose slowly. "Tell me." "The flowers," she said. "They were treated with a rare neurotoxin. It degrades quickly and mimics neurological collapse. It would not have shown up in our standard screens unless we were specifically looking for it." Eamon closed his eyes briefly. He had known. Knowing did not make the truth any lighter. "Do you know where they came from?" Alistair asked. "Yes," the doctor replied. "The delivery was traced. The purchase was routed through a shell account, but the source is clear." She named him. Benedictale, Alistair's oldest friend, his business rival, Peregrine's godfather. The hallway seemed to tilt. Grace pressed a hand to her mouth. Eamon felt a coldness deeper than the water had reached. Alistair exhaled slowly, as if forcing himself not to shatter. "Thank you," he said. "Handle it." The doctor nodded and stepped away. Alistair turned back to Eamon. "Nothing that comes next changes what you did," he said, "or what it cost you to do it." He glanced toward Grace. "Your son will not be punished. Not now. Not ever. He will be protected." Grace hurried forward then, gathering Eamon into her arms. He buried his face in her shoulder, the smell of soap and home grounding him as his body finally gave way to sobs he had been holding back since the kitchen. They stayed like that for a long moment. The days that followed unfolded quietly at first. Peregrine recovered under careful watch, his strength returning in steady increments. The story did not reach the outside world immediately. Alistair insisted on answers before explanations. When they came fully. Walls within the Crown Hill estate shifted, both seen and unseen. Staff meetings included voices that had never been invited before. Kitchens opened. Doors that had always been locked were left ajar. Eamon noticed these changes not because they were announced, but because the house felt different, less like a place he had to tiptoe through. Alistair kept his word. Eamon was given access to education he had never imagined, not as charity, but as acknowledgement. Doctors came to speak with him, not at him, asking careful questions about what he had noticed, how he had learned to notice it all. A year later, the sea wind carried the sound of applause across a new building overlooking the coast. The Rowena Vale Center for Integrative Medicine stood where an empty lot had once been, its glass walls open to light and air. Inside, modern equipment stood beside rooms designed for study, for listening, for learning what did not always fit neatly into textbooks. Eamon stood at the podium, taller now, steadier. He spoke simply, without notes. "My grandmother taught me to pay attention," he said. "She taught me that knowledge does not belong to one kind of person. It belongs to anyone willing to listen." In the front row, Alistair and Seraphine watched, Peregrine between them, a sturdy toddler now with curious eyes. When Eamon finished, Peregrine wriggled free and toddled forward, arms outstretched. He did not reach for his father. He reached for Eamon. The room laughed and cried all at once. If this story moved you, stay with it. Share it with someone who believes their voice does not matter. And remember the wisdom passed down quietly, the kind that saves lives when no one else is listening.